My name is Jared. I'm the president of the Political Economy Society. Before we begin the proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the elders past and present of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land we stand, and to acknowledge that this is stolen land and that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to introduce our speaker for the day, Professor Adam Moore.
Many thanks, Jared, and it's great to see so many ECOP-SOC students here in the audience as well. So, beyond our ancestral lands, today is also very much about the past and the present, and maybe also the future of political economy. We are celebrating formally, I guess, today the appointment of Yanis Varoufakis as an honorary professor within the Department of Political Economy, and I think that deserves a round of applause. But we are also celebrating the almost simultaneous appointment of two additional honorary professors as well, in the form of Professor Eric Wright, who's affiliated as an honorary to the Department of Political Economy, and also Jim Stanford as well, who's appointed as an honorary professor to the Department of Political Economy. And I think they deserve a round of applause. As I joked on social media this morning, this is very much for me a kind of meet your footnotes type of day. So, where to start with Yanis Varoufakis? Well, of course, he was here back in November, and we had an amazing lecture, and I think today will be no different. Since departing from the Syriza government as the finance minister, he's obviously had a very, very quiet 2016. He's published And the Weak Suffer What They Must, which is available in all good bookshops, even on the University of Sydney campus bookshop, which is a miracle. So he has a new book out, which he will be talking, and indeed is currently talking to and about at the Sydney Writers' Festival. He's also obviously launched in Europe the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025. The manifesto is obviously everywhere online, and you can see it also on the Progress in Political Economy blog site. And this is very much something that I think he will be addressing in his lecture today in terms of austerity and democracy within Europe. There is a reference to red pill, which for a certain generation, particularly my honours students, the analogy was immediately grasped, and they had to explain it to me. It's obviously a reference to The Matrix, a film I had seen but had forgotten about, I must admit, where the red pill reveals the truth beyond the appearances of the world, and of course the blue pill keeps those that take it within the ignorance of illusion. So without further ado, I will hand over to Yanis Varoufakis, talking today about political economy, the social sciences red pill. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everyone. As ever, it's wonderful to be back at Sydney, especially given now that I'm in the company of two other honorary professors. This department is growing, at least at the level of the honorary. Honorary professors, and we have professors. Adam, you're the only one, aren't you?
There is one joining us in 2 weeks.
Who is this?
Sujata Fernandez from CUNY.
Very good, very good. So the ratio is being restored. Well, may the Department of Political Economy go from strength to strength, at least may it survive, because political economy is under siege, has been for many years, and this university is one of the few remaining in the world that still takes the red pill, not the blue pill. Now, allow me to tell you my story regarding the blue and the red pills. It started, interestingly, here in Sydney. I'm going to sit because I'm getting a bit tired and old. It started here in Sydney in 1988. I just come to Sydney from Britain, and I had a very interesting experience. Frank will remember that, and Gavin will remember that. I think I was the first member of staff to teach both in political economy and in vulgar economics, as Marx defined. And when I was teaching, well, I was appointed by the vulgar economics people, only on the basis that they had seen my work and it contained equations, so they immediately assumed that I must be a neoliberal, to their detriment, and then they discovered what a colossal error they had made after my appointment. But anyway, it was fun. I always taught Economics 101, whatever it was called, Economics 1 actually, it was called back then. And I always chose the first semester, first week, get them when they're young. That's the attitude. And I still enjoy doing that. To be one of the first faces that students see, and Frank always did that too. I think we were the ones that introduced students to economics, me in Economics 1 and you in Economics 1P, as it was called then. Yeah? And in standard economics, neoclassical economics, what does the textbook begin with? It begins with an assumption, a highly philosophical assumption which is presented as fact, not as a philosophical axiom. And it is the assumption that society comprises of atoms, individuals. Individuals are characterized fully, not just characterized, but they are characterized fully, comprehensively, exclusively by their preferences, a bundle of preferences. And all that they do in life is try to satisfy them. It's technically is the utility maximization principle. Yeah? And then on the basis of this assumption, since utility is then immediately presumed to be modelable as a function, as a mathematical function, then the mathematics kicks in, and the maximization of utility functions yields all sorts of instruments of torture for first-year students, like demand curves, elasticities, supply curves, and all that. So a kind of mathematical physics is built upon it. Now, the problem I had as a teacher of this discipline in the neoclassical traditional mainstream course was that students actually bought it. I would, introduce the principle of utility maximization and immediately try to criticize it, try to say to them, yes, but of course you realize that there is something here amiss. There are huge, important aspects of the human condition that do not fit into this. And they would say, no. What's missing? Yeah, we are bundles of preferences. Somebody likes apples over oranges, another person likes to do good things. It's a preference. You choose to be relatively altruistic. You get more satisfaction out of helping others, but still it's your own preference that is being satisfied. So the model works perfectly well. In an attempt, a desperate attempt, to convince them that, no, there is still something amiss, I try to tell a story. So I would teach the conventional theory with the diagrams and the mathematics and the maximization and all that. And once we grasped it, then I would create a mental experiment for them. This was 1988, 1999, 1990. Yeah? And the mental experiment was the following. Imagine that in this room there is a magnificent computer developed by proper scientists, not economists like us, from down the road. And what this machine can do is firstly read perfectly accurately your own preferences. And secondly, if you lie down next to a bed, on a bed which is next to the machine, and there is a team of nurses and medical staff that look after you, electrodes get attached to your brain, and the machine can create a virtual reality in your mind, which is completely in accordance with your own preferences. So this machine is your friend. It is not brainwashing you. It is not implanting into your mind things that you don't want. Yeah? So think of it as the ultimate utility maximizer. It reads your utility function, it knows exactly what preferences you have, what you like and what you don't like, your desires, your passions, and creates a virtual reality, a life which to you, when you're attached to this machine, is as real as this one. And you live the dream. Your dream, not somebody else's dream. They say, oh, this is interesting, that would be good to have. Of course, it's the ultimate drug, isn't it? And then the question is, will you join the machine? But before you decide, if you decide to join the machine, you will have to join it forever, under the guarantee that the medical team will make sure that your body is looked after perfectly well, and you will live much longer than you would have lived normally, simply because there is no chance of you being run over by a bus, and so on and so forth. Yeah? So, would you press the button and be connected to that machine, knowing that at that moment you just lose any sensation of reality, and you get into this virtual reality which serves your preferences best? The reason why I was giving them this kind of mental experiment was in order to incite them to cast a critical gaze upon utility maximization as a theory. Because what I would say to them is, if you choose not to join that machine, then you can't agree with the principle of utility maximization. Because you must think that there is something else other than utility that matters in life, and this something else is preventing you from joining the machine. But of course, because they were smart kids, some of them would say, no, Professor, this is not true. I have a preference for reality. And therefore, my utility, before I make the decision, is maximized intertemporally, because my current preference for reality is so much greater than the accumulation of all the utilities that I would get from the machine, that I choose reality. You know, such a huge, it's like somebody worships a particular kind of food, whatever. There's no difference. I would say to them, this is a very interesting point. So the actual decision to switch off from this reality to another reality is causing you so much disutility that you choose not to make. That makes sense. But imagine, then I would follow up, that this machine now has a version 2.0. It's more sophisticated than the original one. Now the machine can take over your mind without you making a choice, without you choosing to join the machine. The machine takes you over. And you faint, and the team takes you into the bed, but you haven't realized there's complete continuity between this present moment and the machine, the life attached to the machine. Would you agree with me that a world in which all of us have been taken over by the machine, and there are other machines serving our bodies while we are attached to the utility machine, living the dream without knowing that we are attached to the machine, and without ever having to make the decision to be attached to the machine? Do you agree with me or not that this is the ideal society? A society in which there is one large machine and millions or billions of people lying down in beds, looked after by other machines, switched on to the life that is individually tailor-made by the machine in their own minds. That this is the ideal good society. And then, of course, we would have a show of hands. And the majority would say no. Some committed utilitarians would say it's the ideal life. There would be other kinds of objections. Some would say, but I prefer to have a genuine experience of helping others if I'm altruistic, and not a fake one in my mind. Then, of course, you get into the standard philosophical discussion. So define reality. How do you know that we are not now attached to some machine, and that this is more real than something else? So, but anyway, so this was my way of making them think that there is something profoundly wrong with utility maximization. And of course, you know what it is. It is in a dialectical sense, in a Hegelian sense, a Kantian sense, a Marxist sense. It is that, or a Wittgensteinian sense, that constraints do not only stop us from doing things, but they also help us develop as human beings. Which means what? It means that our preferences are evolving as a result of hitting against the barrier of constraints. It means that as we are forced by life to often do things that give us a lot less utility than we would like. In that process, we develop as human beings, we get better preferences, to use a Socratic term. In the Socratic tradition, of course, well-being, successful living at a personal level is what matters. But unlike the liberal, individualistic, Humean tradition, successful life cannot be defined on the basis of one's preferences, because one has very stupid preferences, very often. And unless one gets an opportunity to develop better preferences, then one never gets to grow into the talents that one innately has. But the utility machine doesn't know that. It removes all constraints. So you will never develop. You'll become the same moron that you are now. You will be until you die. Because the machine knows nothing other than to serve you as a servant who in the end becomes a master, having removed all the liberating constraints. That was the story I was trying to tell. Now imagine my great pleasure and also slight disappointment when I watched The Matrix, which was filmed here at the Fox Studios. You know that, don't you? Right? So, The Matrix is exactly that story. It's a dystopia, as I meant it to be for our students. Instead of choosing to join the machine or not to join the machine, you're already the machine. You're given a glimpse of the state in which you find yourself in by Morpheus, if you remember. And Morpheus presents you with a red pill and a blue pill. And if you take the blue pill, you forget about it all. You forget that your life is not real and that you are attached to a machine that is creating this fake virtual reality in your mind. If you take the red pill, you live a horrible, difficult life of constant struggle against a dystopia. But at least you get a chance, firstly, to live a real life, and secondly, to change it. Now, you can understand from my title that I genuinely consider political economy to be the kind of discipline one indulges in if one doesn't care about having an easy life. Political economy is going to create obstacles, serious obstacles, on the path to career progression, whether your career is in business or in politics or in any realm where truth is not necessarily, and the serving of truth is not necessarily the path to happiness, success, and power. Speaking truth to power in particular comes at a hefty price in many, many countries around the world, including in this one. By comparison, the neoclassical economic tradition, the mainstream of economics, is the blue pill. Think about what you learn if you do a Masters of Commerce or Masters of Economics, not just here, anywhere. You learn that we live in a Panglossian world. We live in the best of all possible worlds. Even if we don't have optimality, even if we have market failures, still the social economy, the social market economy in which we find ourselves is the best we could possibly have, and the only improvements that can be had can be achieved if we move closer to the model that we are learning from our textbooks. Through deregulation, getting rid of unions, and all those impediments to the felicitous operation of market forces. So if you get locked into that mindset, the world looks like a wonderful place, as long as you learn to adapt yourself to it and not to question its fundamental assumptions. So it's another form of religion, in a sense, that as long as you accept the dictum, as long as you accept the dogma, progression through the ranks of the priesthood is rapid. It guarantees you a very decent job. You can get a mortgage by the time you're 26. This is a measure of success in this country, isn't it? how I long for the crashing of the housing market to put an end to this illusion. Anyway, and then all you need to do is you need to learn to work this model, to work within the confines of this model, to learn to recite the sermons, and at the very same time to create variations of the theme, but without actually rocking the boat too much. Now, the red pill is one that you take at your own peril. There have been economists who took the red pill and didn't suffer. But that was a long time ago. Let me give you a couple of examples. I'll mention the guru of the mainstream of economics, Kenneth Arrow. Ken Arrow was a standard mathematical economist, indeed, probably the best that ever lived. He still lives, knock on wood, and he's really well still. His mind is sharp as ever. I met him some time ago, not that long ago. Kenneth Arrow did not have the kind of left-wing background that some of us do. He didn't question mainstream economics from a philosophical perspective. He didn't have this worry that I had that utility leaves a lot that matters about humanity out of its functions. No, he was a meticulous mathematician and a meticulous logician. So he accepted all that and indulged in what Karl Marx might have defined as immanent criticism, not imminent, immanent criticism. So immanent criticism, to the extent that I understand it, means the following. You take the theory of someone else, you take the assumptions that someone else has made to build the theory, you do not question the assumptions, not because you don't want to question them, but as an exercise, you say, okay, let's assume that you're right, that these assumptions hold. Let's see, do you really get to the conclusions from those assumptions that you think you're getting? In Euclid's geometry, that's straightforward to prove. You start with some basic assumptions, basic axioms, like for instance, that if you have a straight line and have a point off the straight line, there is only one line that you can draw through that point that is parallel to the other line. Okay, that's an assumption. If you make it, you make another 2 or 3 such assumptions, then you can prove Pythagoras' theorem. And there are no two ways about it. You cannot challenge the fact that from those particular assumptions, you get to the theorem. In economics, it's not that clear. So Ken Arrow was one of those neoclassical economists who had no philosophical objection to neoclassicism, he had no political objection to neoclassicism, but he was a curious mind. And he took the assumption of utility maximization and then tried to check one presumption, not assumption, a presumption that was central to the practice of mainstream economists. It was the presumption that just like an individual has a utility function whose maximization tells you all you need to know about rational individual behavior, society has a similar function whose maximization, if achieved, tells you what's good for society. It's called a welfare function, a social welfare function. Now that was a presumption that if the individual has a utility function whose maximization yields the outcome that explains rational behavior, that something similar must happen, must obtain for society as a whole. And the presumption takes, to put it a little bit more accurately, takes the form of a theorem that if you begin with n people would be all Australian citizens, or all citizens of the world, humanity as a whole, if you take n utility functions, 1 per person, that there must exist some mechanism, some mathematical function, to be more precise, that translates this collection of utility functions, of individual utility functions, into one collective utility function, the social welfare function, whose maximization would yield what's good for society. You see, if you believe, if you accept the method of the mainstreaming in economics, which is to say, okay, we begin at the micro level. We begin like physicists do at the level of the smallest entity, which is the atom, the social atom, the individual. And everything we're going to say from now on will be built on knowledge that we acquire by studying each atom, each individual. And you say, okay, my method of study will home in the assumption that each one of us maximizes a particular utility function. And then we find out what we all do together. But then the question is, what do we do collectively? What justifies the state to tax you? You cannot explain this on the basis of Jack's or Jill's utility maximization. There must be a utility function for both Jack and Jill whose maximization yields the optimal sales tax or income tax or corporate tax, whatever. But is there a way of taking Jack's and Jill's utility functions and combining them into a common one? That is the question that Ken Arrow asked. All economists up until that time were taking for granted that surely there is one. And they were using examples from political science and politics in the same way that we all have political preferences. And there is an electoral system and constitution that transforms our individual preferences into our country's preference. It's called a general election. Surely there must be a way of combining all individual utility functions to create a social welfare function. And what he did in the space of a couple of years, during which he produced other important theorems of neoclassical economics, he proved probably the most radical and significant theorem of the social sciences of the 20th century, Arrow's impossibility theorem. He proved that under certain assumptions that almost everyone accepts, especially neoclassical economists, there exists no way of aggregating individual preferences into society's preference. And therefore, neoclassical economics has nothing to say about what is in the interests of society, which is a rather significant problem for neoclassical economics. Because suddenly, there can be no theory of taxation. There can be no theory of international trade. Remember, in international trade theory, what neoclassical economists do traditionally, and they have to do it, is they treat each country as an entity with its own utility function, with its own well-defined interests. Now, what is this utility function? It's the aggregation of the utility functions of all its citizens. But that doesn't exist, according to Arrow. You can only have it if you assume full dictatorship. One person that has preferences that trump everybody's preferences on every issue. Okay? But, of course, neoliberals, who are neither new nor liberal, by the way, still want to pretend that they're liberals, so they can't accept the dictatorship principle in order to get out of that conundrum. So, here is an example of an economist who was writing in the 1950s who bit the red pill. In a sense, I remember listening to him giving a speech sometime in 1992 in New York at NYU. And it was actually such a pleasure to listen to him. Most of it was extremely tedious because there were just equation upon equation on the blackboard, whiteboard, whatever it was. But there was one of the professors from NYU and said, Professor Arrow, equation 35b makes me think that, you know, especially if you combine it by lemma 23/7, that the idea of taxing land as opposed to taxing income, a Georgian kind of idea, may be closer to optimality. And Arrow stopped him in his tracks and said, my dear boy, he was a bit condescending, which is good. My dear boy, you are confusing that which is interesting with that which is useful. This is interesting, meaning it's not useful. And if you... Now, problem is that today, take a master's student or a PhD student who goes through the rigmarole of mainstream economics and does all that. What are the chances of landing a lectureship? If you say to your professors today, or if you try to publish today a similar article, which effectively pulls the rug from under the feet of the whole profession. The whole profession who want to tell stories about what is good for society. They want to tell macroeconomic stories based on this kind of utility maximization neoclassical analysis. Back in the 1950s and 60s, universities and economics departments still had a culture of critical thinking and criticism. Today, if you try to publish an article of that sort, you're going to crash on the shows of major denial. I had an experience some time ago when I was actually at Sydney. I sent an article to the Economic Journal. I had already published an article in the Economic Journal, which was empirical, so it was not particularly dangerous. It was an empirical regularity, and it was published. But that second article challenged the very concept of equilibrium in game theory. I'm not going to bother you with it. And it was extremely interesting because I got 2 referees' reviews. Actually, no, before I got there, the editor of the journal wrote back to me, he read it, and he wrote back to me and he said, this is a very important paper, blah, 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 I want to publish it, I'm sending it to referees. Fine. 2 referee reports come back. One was exceedingly positive and had some very good points and queries and comments to which I had to respond. It was a joy to respond. It took me 2 months to respond because they were quite complicated. But nevertheless, this was a critical engagement with a referee. The second one read, I still have kept that letter, verbatim. This is a brilliant paper, and he used the word brilliant. This is a brilliant paper that undermines the concept of game theory. Full stop. Don't even think of publishing it. And the editor sent me these letters back saying, can you please comment on the more critical referee? So I immediately assumed that the critical referee was the one with 3 pages of comments and questions, real critical points. So I responded to this. It took me 2 months. And the editor wrote back and said, no, I meant the other one. So I said, okay. I wrote a letter saying, this is a brilliant paper, publish it. And the response was, I cannot go against this person because this person is too important in the discipline. Okay? Now, I'm simply relating this story to you to explain what I consider to be the grave dilemma in which economists within the mainstream, like Arrow today, would face, and why that would be the red pill. Because today, to get to the point when you can actually challenge received wisdom, and these kinds of assumptions, not assumptions, but presumptions, that underpin everything that you hear mainstream economists say, because nothing that you hear them say on television, in Q&A, in the pages of financial newspapers, has any basis on even their own analysis. For reasons that Arrow's impossibility theorem explains quite well. The personal tragedy of the PhD student who tries to do what? Takes one of those models and either dissects it like Arrow did, and then has to go against the whole profession that will treat him or her with contempt. Or who tries to do something different, but also equally important, which is what? To make the model a bit more realistic. Let me give you an example. There is this mathematical economist, used to be a mathematical economist, can't remember where he was, I think it was the Columbia, Matthew Rabin is his name, who tried to introduce, try to return a little bit of a psychological texture to rational economic man. And I say man because I'm sure that Homo economicus is a man. If you read the text, this cannot be a woman. It's such a patriarchal figure. I think any feminist would agree. So he actually tried to introduce a very simple psychological thought that, for instance, we do not only care about outcomes, but we also care about what others think that we think. So, for instance, take a young person who has parents and peers that have expectations of this young person. So, for instance, parents who expect their child to get a degree in economics, or in law, or in medicine, whatever, right? And this child, this young person, has preferences that reflect what this person thinks, that this young person thinks, parents think that he or she will study. So second-order expectations infiltrate the utility function and create a far more congenial and realistic picture of a human person who doesn't only care about whether he or she is going to become a doctor or not, or an economist or not, but the utility he or she gets from becoming an economist or a doctor also depends on the weight of others' expectations upon him or her. So, Rabin demonstrates this very nicely by saying, imagine you have a situation where you would rather become an artist. But if your mum wants you to be a doctor, you do not want to disappoint her, and disappointing her reduces your utility, so you may choose to become an economist, even though there is no coercion, explicit coercion. That kind of thing. Yeah, now, mathematically, it's possible to model this. But you know what happens? Indeterminacy. You can't solve the model. If you have people like that, you do never, to put it in simple macroeconomic terms, you never end up with simple demand curves. Actually, demand curves cannot be defined. Because demand curves, where the demand curve is, depends on what I think that you think that I think. And it's impossible, therefore, to pin down a precise, determinate relationship between price and quantity demanded. So the whole thing explodes. Now, what I have observed in a variety of universities, especially in the United States, is this. Professors, supervisors, encourage students to play around with the models, to try to make them more realistic, to infuse a degree of humanity in the utility functions, in the assumptions, to play around to see what they can produce. But in their third year of their PhD, the time comes to submit. And you are not allowed to submit a PhD unless you've solved the model. But to solve the model, you either have to do away with all the nice, fuzzy, warm stuff that you've infused into your model of men and women, either you have to get rid of it, in which case you have to start from scratch. All your work is jettisoned. Or you need to do something really sneaky to introduce through the back door a hidden assumption which can never be explained logically, but which allows you to solve the mathematics. And of course, this is what they do. Right? And then those who read the PhD and the scholarly paper that has been published out of it, it's impossible to understand what makes this model tick, because the assumption that makes it tick is hidden. Now, think of the dilemma of the young, honest academic who is at that moment facing a choice between closing the model or never getting a PhD. It takes a heroic disposition to say, to hell with you, I'm not closing a model on the basis of assumptions that are logically incoherent. And, if I state them, nobody is ever going to accept it. Would it make sense to just close it for the hell of it, to get a PhD, become an academic, spend 15 years until you're promoted to senior lecturer, and then spill the beans on the profession, which is what I've been doing. Well, psychologists tell us that cognitive dissonance is a very painful thing, and the human spirit, mind, soul has a tendency to remove it. So if you keep saying, if you keep doing this in order to finish your PhD, publish the 2 papers that are necessary as a minimum to get your first job, then publish another 10 to be promoted to senior lecturer, and by the time you're 35 or 40, how many heroes are there in the world who will then spill the beans, turn around and bite the red pill? The answer is very few. Especially when your income depends on not spilling those beans, and especially in the era of financialization, where the financial sector pays you huge quantities of money to take those models that you've closed and to transplant them to finance. Let me now move away from academia just for a few minutes and transport you to the world of finance before and after 2008. Remember those wonderful collateralized debt obligations, CDOs and the CDO squares and the ABSs, all these complex derivatives. Remember value at risk measures? Do you remember Dr. Lee's famous formula for computing the value of particular complex financial structured products? All those were mathematical models, and they had to be solved in order to play their role. So for instance, the head of Lehman Brothers, the head of JP Morgan, every day would go to work and would demand the VAR value, the value at risk, which would tell him, it was usually him, how much of the assets of the company was at risk that day, given the developments in the financial markets. He wanted a number. But to have this number, some model had to be closed. Now, remember the hidden axiom which was necessary to close the models of our hapless PhD student? That was the kind of axiom that had to be embedded, hidden axiom, inside those financial sector models. Exactly the same. It was an equilibrium assumption. It was an assumption that equilibrates the various variables that make up that model, which yields the number that the boss of Lehman Brothers or JP Morgan demanded every morning. But what does it mean to impose the assumption of determinacy and equilibrium? In the world of macroeconomics and finance, it is to assume that the variance-covariance matrix of risks involving all these derivatives had numbers in the diagonal and zeros everywhere else. In other words, there was no correlation, no statistical correlation between the probability that I default and the probability that you default. Or it was epsilon tending to 0, a positive number but very close, vanishingly small. Now, when it comes to the probability that I will break my leg in my bath today, and that you will break your leg as a result of my breaking my leg, we live in different homes, we're not in the same bath, okay? It makes perfect sense to assume that these probabilities are independent, and therefore the covariance between the two variables is 0, or vanishingly small. But to make that assumption about the financial market is equivalent of assuming that there can never be a crisis. So all these numbers were based on the hidden assumption that there can never be a crisis. But of course, if there can never be a crisis, you don't need VAR. You don't need these measures at all, do you? Right? So now you see what now, the people who actually produced those models were young people like you who had been through the standard education that economists go through, and they were making millions. So, if you are one of them, you've got every incentive to learn the trick of introducing hidden assumptions and biting the blue pill all the time. If you wanted to be an academic an academic economist with a research grant, a professorship, and not have to worry about whether your department will close tomorrow. You had to produce the models and the papers that would get published in the journals which the priesthood of neoclassicism considered to be the ones that give you the most brownie points, which then converted into themselves, translated into more kudos in the university, greater research grants, and so on and so forth. To go in a third direction of biting the red pill of political economy and questioning through immanent criticism all these models was to condemn yourself either to permanent unemployment or to being in a department like political economy, which constantly struggles for its survival and constantly has to, Adam, Frank before him, when I was involved in political economy in the University of Athens, we constantly had to hold the fort against monumentally powerful forces squashing the living daylights out of it. Why? Because the red pill is very dangerous to the established order of things. It is a kind of heretic thinking that it doesn't matter to them whether it comes from somebody like Kenneth Arrow or a Marxist or a Keynesian. I mentioned two people who in a distant past bit the red pill and didn't suffer too much from it. The other, of course, was Keynes. Because Keynes made a fundamental transition from the blue pill to the red pill, and thus had a theory, had something useful to say in 1936 about the Great Depression. Had he not bitten the red pill, there would be absolutely no commentary that made sense in 1936 about the grapes of wrath. Now, I'll finish with a warning. Those of us who think that we are biting the red pill, whether we're Marxists, Keynesians, post-Keynesians, Straffians, we must beware. We must not fall in love with ourselves. Because if we do, there is a very strong possibility that the pill that we're biting, which looks as if it is red, is getting bluer and bluer and bluer. This is my criticism of a lot of Marxism, for instance, and I speak as a Marxist. The way in which dialectics has been lost in sterile discussions about the labor theory of value. The way in which even Marx himself, as he was being lured into British political economy, steadily removed himself from his earlier commitment to the dialectical process. These are, and have been, in the past, processes that have led heretics, red pillars, very quickly to create their own little fiefdom, seeking the truth in some alternative system of equations, where the truth never actually resides. I'm a mathematician by training. I believe that mathematics is essential, but the truth about political economy can never lie in the equations. Political economy will remain the red pill, the dangerous red pill, as long as, to begin with, we teach it the way that Frank Stilwell has been doing for decades in this university, the way I've been trying to teach it, the way I'm sure everybody involved in this department is trying to do it, through a combination of three things. Firstly, economic history. It has to be historically located. When you talk about capital, when you talk about rent, you cannot talk about it in the abstract. When you talk about the labor process, it must be located historically. Economic history. History of economic thought in conjunction with economic history. Why was it that the Kohn laws led Ricardo to the concept of economic rent? It did not come from parthenogenesis. Why was it that what happened in 1848 and what caused Marx to adapt the Ricardian model in order to bring in the dual nature, the dialectical nature of labor, which then creates a dialectical theory about capital, and capital becomes a social relation of production. So, those two things. Economic, the history of capitalism, together with the history of our thinking about capitalism. And thirdly, lots and lots of skepticism, especially of things that look as if they've been solved. Nothing ever gets solved in political economy. Allow me to finish by saying that, just to finish up with a story that brings me closer to the lecture that I gave in November when I was here. When a finance minister of a distressed state is negotiating with the International Monetary Fund, the weapon that the International Monetary Fund throws at you is a mathematical model. At that moment, it is crucial to be able to read it. You can't dismiss it. You can't say, oh, I'm not interested in mathematics. Okay? This is the panzer by which your country is being invaded. And you need to know how to take it apart. Knowing how to take it apart is not enough. It's a necessary condition. It is not a sufficient condition. So, this lecture of mine is not about turning our back to mathematical thinking. No. It is about turning our back to the idea that the truth will lie in the mathematics. And finally, I want to share with you my greatest disappointment from Sydney University's political economy department. It's got nothing to do with the people in it. It's got to do with the fact that I've been here long enough, or I was here so long ago, that I had the experience of encountering some of our students from political economy 10, 20 years after they graduated. And it was quite sad to me that there was a very significant proportion of some of our brightest, some, not all of them, some of our brightest, who had gone to the dark side of the force. Who had experienced the critical reasoning of political economy, learned how to be Jedis of political economy, mixing my science fiction metaphors here, okay? And then sold themselves to the financial sector, and then looked upon people like Frank, Gavin, and myself with a little bit of contempt and sympathy. Yeah. Are you still interested in Marx and Keynes? So, beware. Thank you.
We have roughly 30 minutes or so for questions. I'll hand the mic over to some of our current students from ECOPSOC and our past students from ECOPSOC, which might need to beware as well about their own futures. Just a show of hands in the usual way, and we'll get these people to circulate. Thank you.
Happening again in Wall Street in the City of London. Already we have new developments and new supercharged and turbocharged financial derivatives, which are now being also aided and abetted by the easy money quantitative easing policies of the central banks. There are new subprime markets that are developing everywhere. So for instance, in the United States now we have student loans is the new subprime market, car loans, the new subprime market, and already we have structured derivatives being built on the back of that. My great concern, however, you see, Marx was right, history repeats itself but as a farce the second time. My fear now is that the next big crash is not going to be coming from those markets, because before they develop sufficiently and mature sufficiently to crash, we have the emerging market bubbles that are the greatest source of concern and discontent. If you think of that China today has a debt to GDP ratio, private and public, of 275%, last time I looked. If you look at the fact that we have the perfect storm brewing, for the first time in many, many, many decades, we have the convergence of two disasters. The American dollar is going to start edging up because of tapering in the United States by Janet Yellen, while the commodity cycle is taking a turn downwards. So you can see what's happening in Latin America as a result of the deflation, which is very clear and present as a danger in China. All this is a preamble for saying that Australia is not going to escape the next downturn the way that it did in 2008. 2008 was a miracle. The Rudd government did a pretty good job at not indulging in austerity, at actually stimulating the economy. The fact that the banks were far more impressed by the possibility of making money out of mortgages and personal loans than from financial derivatives also saved you here. But the next one is going to hit where it hurts. And if you look at the private debt to GDP ratio in this country and connect it to developments in Latin America and China, add to this the deflationary state of Europe, which is undermining China on a daily basis, things are not looking good.
Okay, thank you. Just be patient as the mic moves around. The organisers of this room, in their wisdom, have given us just one mic, so it will take a little while to travel around.
This one there. So we have two people taking
No
one mic.
equilibrium in the question distribution, I said.
Would you see new? Oh,
Yeah, could you stand up? Thanks.
Would you see new institutional economics and economic sociology as a meaningful yellow pill, as somewhat of counterbalance?
Yellow pill?
Yeah. As a
What's a yellow
counterbalance.
I don't know what a yellow pill is. You have to define it.
Maybe between reality and illusion, somewhere in between.
I don't know how to answer this question. Any kind of sensible analysis, which does what I was saying before, combines historically located concepts with critical reasoning, whether you call it institution, I don't care what you call it, as long as it's helpful to shed light on social processes. They are part of the red pill. Anything which is done in order to procure careers on the basis of hidden assumptions that cannot be explained on the basis of logic and history contributes to the blue pill. I do not believe in the yellow pill. Okay. I'm a blue and the red person.
Thank you for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. You gave the demonstration of Arrow, Rabin, Keynes, yourself, this journey which is blue pillars who at some stage have evolved at Damascus moment, and they take the economic benefits of 30 years of tenure and all this journey and then turn around. Looking at the current balance of social forces that we have, I like to think it's never been worse, I'm not sure. If I start off and say, okay, I want to take the journey, the exaltation you've given us to be red pillars, I look back on 15 years as a foot soldier for the left to a largely feckless and impotent effect. But I get to the stage where I now say, okay, this is brilliant, I've done this for 15 years and I'm broken. there's no resources for me. There's nothing out there to start that journey. What's the path to victory to stay on the line of being a red pillar presently, whereas a casual academic you're getting shifted?
You'll find out. No one can tell you. The answer is no one can tell you. It's a difficult path. It's the path of maximum resistance. And when you are on a path of maximum resistance, you've got to feel and grope your way and find which, parts of the wall that's surrounding you you can push and get through. I have nothing to, there's no advice I can give you on this. We all have to do things according to our conscience. Surviving life at a personal level, the level of the family, is a big task today, and how to combine that with doing the right thing and keep biting the red pill is something that we have to help one another find individual answers to.
Next question, please.
Just to add to the first question, I'm watching in the global economy itself, and you're stating that the US dollar seems to be on a path of demise. If that does happen, rising.
Yes, it's rising.
Yeah, but
It will be rising.
it will be rising.
Yes.
Do you believe that there's a potential that it actually might fall and the American empire could collapse going forward? And the reason I'm asking that is because if that does happen and the views of, I guess, let's say, the new world wanting to create a single currency and special drawdown rights, I just want your views on what you think will happen in, say, 5 to 10 years from now.
Well, let's begin. Of course, all empires collapse. The United States will not be the superpower forever, right? But I think that it's premature to start thinking about it at the moment. The American dollar remains the reserve currency. It remains the anchor of the international financial system. At the moment, you have deflationary tendencies everywhere except in the United States. That, by definition, means that the United States dollar is going to go up, in my view, in the next 18 months. I can't tell you beyond that. My crystal ball can't see beyond that. Yeah? But it will be a difficult 18 months because it will mean that increasingly Chinese companies that are over-leveraged and they have debt denominated in US dollars are going to try their best to convert the renminbi into dollars in order to deleverage. That is going to have a downward pressure on the renminbi. That is going to create political tensions with the United States. And in effect, we're reliving the 1930s of competitive devaluations. Donald Trump has made abundantly clear that he's going to be part of this. And he will try to devalue the dollar. The problem is that if everybody tries to devalue their currency, it can't work. On the global currency, it's funny you should ask this. Effectively, I think that what you are asking harks back to a kind of new Bretton Woods. The reactivation of the original idea by John Maynard Keynes of the International Clearing Union and the banker. And the reason why I'm excited by you mentioning that or alluding to it is because my latest article was exactly that, imagining a new Bretton Woods, where I'm trying to imagine what a system would be where you would have free-floating exchange rates, but all international trade is denominated in a common currency, digital currency, which is performing and functioning along the lines of Keynes' original idea. But of course, this is simply an intellectual exercise, because in 1944, there was a single superpower, the United States. Europe was in ruins, or in the process of being even more ruined. And the immediate post-war period was unique in history for having granted the capacity to one state to get everybody together around the table at Bretton Woods and design a system that lasted for 20 years. Do we have the capacity to do this now, even if we have a good blueprint? I doubt it.
Next question, please. Jim. Do you need the mic, Jim?
Well, probably not, actually.
No.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Yanis, I agree with your analysis of the next crisis, the next financial crash, and that it will probably be worse than the last one for various reasons. Can you talk a little bit about the politics of the next crash and how progressives can do a better job preparing for it and being ready to respond to that moment with a vision that's convincing and doable, which we clearly were not the last time. My fear, of course, is that if we're not, then the intellectual bankruptcy of the establishment, when it crashes again, and it certainly will push so many people to a populist right or even fascist alternative. And so it's dangerous on both levels. And you, of course, have a huge and painful personal experience trying to build that alternative. What would your advice and perspective be for thinking about that globally?
Well, I think we need to do two things. And I'm going to speak now about Europe and the United States, because we move in parallel, and you can see that we have similar, even though Europe is a basket case compared to the United States, but nevertheless we have similar experiences. We have on both continents, we have this lurch to the ultra-right, to the populist, xenophobic, quasi-fascist tradition. In Europe it's everywhere, in Hungary, in Poland, in Austria, in Greece, in France, in Germany now with AfD and so on and so forth. In the United States, just one word, Trump. At the same time, there is to every action there is a reaction. We have progressive movements in Europe that are trying to find their bearings. Some of us have created one in Europe. We call it DiEM, the Democracy in Europe movement. And what we are trying to do with DiEM is we are trying to create the circumstances for keeping internationalism alive. Because what happens with a never-ending post-2008 world in crisis is that nationalism rears its ugly head, and just like in the 1920s and 30s, it also turns out to be quite alluring, quite appealing to elements of the left. So if you look at the French left, for instance, my friend Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is the left-wing candidate for the presidency, his narrative is becoming increasingly economic nationalism. Yeah? The retreat, the European Union is a failure, of course it is. It is a neoliberal project, it has betrayed its people, Europeans, so let's do away with it. I agree with the first few sentences. The let's do away with it is where I disagree. Why? Not because I have any degree of affection for the European Union institutions. Goodness knows I suffered under them and within them. No, the reason is that their implosion is going to create centrifugal forces that will not strengthen Mélenchon, La Fontaine in Germany, the communists in Greece. No, it will strengthen the xenophobes and the racists and the fascists. So to me it's essential that we combine criticism for the failing institutions with an internationalist progressive narrative which that creates a hierarchy of tasks. The first task should be stabilization at the moment. Stabilization in Europe in particular. The left never benefits from a debt deflationary spiral. The debt deflationary spiral is going to destroy us completely. So a narrative of what needs to be done to stabilize Europe and to stabilize the United States, for instance, right? To stabilize Social Security in the United States, Medicare, Medicaid, the food stamp program. These are important institutions that need to be preserved, even though on their own they cannot defend the people of America from the crisis that they've had, they're having, and they will be having. But nevertheless, we need to do this. So that's why I think that Bernie Sanders in the United States is a breath of fresh air, because he's creating a movement which is simultaneously internationalist and supportive of those who are either discarded from society or those who constantly experience the wage secular stagnation. And in Europe, we're trying to do the same thing with DM. Now that's one dimension, opposing the forces of economic nationalism that are leading towards a deconstruction of common institutions that can potentially stabilize and build a progressive narrative on. The second thing we need to do, and this is something that I am particularly worried about, is we need to appeal to youngsters who don't give a damn about us, people of the left, of the political economic tradition, the young 16-year-old from Mumbai that only cares about how to create the next killer app that will make him, usually him, $1 billion in Silicon Valley. How do you appeal to this person? Unless we have a narrative that appeals to these people, we are lost. And that is a very long discussion. I don't want to give another lecture on this, but I think this is essential for the politics that will allow us, out of the ashes of the next crash, which is coming and we can't prevent it, to create more internationalism and to appeal to the young ones who think that technology is the solution, when technology is part of the solution and can never be the solution.
Okay, next question, I think, Leon.
I do not work alone in your field. I'm a brain scientist, so I'm just here being invited. My question is, I watch television here in Australia. I'm very bored by all the politicians. When I watch you, I know you concentrate on Europe, but would you ever consider having a more political sort of role within Australia?
Me?
To rebound from what you just said before, you're saying, we need to appeal, the left need to appeal to a younger generation. I mean, Bernie is doing it in the US, and he's actually catching that young generation. When I listen to you on the telly, the few times I listen to you, or YouTube, whatever, I'm like, someone who's interesting, who's got something to say, and also bring that left discourse that also really anti-xenophobic, because there's a big issue with that in Europe. So maybe it's a bit of a provocative question, but it would be great to have you in Australia.
Well, you know that I carry an Australian passport with pride, and I have very strong roots in this country. My daughter is growing up here, so I have this commitment to Australia. But I have to tell you that when I decided to throw my hand in the political ring in Greece a year and a half ago, I was living in the States, and I moved to Greece, and I made a pledge to the people whose vote I sought. And it came from the heart, that I'm never going to leave Greece again. I didn't want to be one of those, visiting professors that comes in, becomes a visiting politician as well, and then gets out when the going gets tough. So I made a pledge to them that I'm never going to leave Greece again. And I intend to keep it.
Yanis, I want to talk a little bit more about theory. You spoke on some of the most beautiful contradictions in game theory, I think, Arrow's impossibility theorem and Rabin's fairness equilibrium. Are these contradictions an indication that game theory could be the window for philosophy, bringing philosophy back into economics? And does that mean that we as political economists should be paying attention to game theory?
That's very interesting. I was actually having dinner the other night, a couple of weeks ago, with Roger Myerson, one of the Nobel Prize winners Actually, it's not a real Nobel, you know. The fake Nobel Prize of the Bank of Sweden. A brilliant man, a very nice person too. And he had written an article in 1985-86 in which he was actually arguing that game theory is the unifying science of the social sciences. And I had written an article against it, explaining why I think he's wrong. But you know, over dinner we converged on some common ground. That game theory is a wonderful way, studying game theory is a wonderful way of understanding the limits of analytical reasoning and where you need to stop looking for answers from analysis and make the transition to dialectics. So, as a gateway into understanding the limitations of mathematics, of logic, of mathematical logic, this is very important, you know, because all these tools have an amazing allure. And it's very easy to think that, like Bertrand Russell did when he was a young man, that everything can be worked out from first principles through logic. And then, of course, Wittgenstein came into his life and taught him that that is not true, and then he stopped doing mathematical logic, right? But it is important to know the limits of the calculating part of our brain. Now, do you want to spend years doing that? That's another matter. But to some extent, it is important. It's actually a good tool to use game theory as a pedagogical method for exploring the limits of analytical reasoning.
I think we have time for just two more questions. So, Troy?
Thanks, Yanis. Given that the Marxist, classical, post-Keynesian, Strappian critiques of neoclassical economics are all well established, or even the internal neoclassical critiques, and since the GFC, it seems that heterodox economics has gone backwards as a discipline around the world, do you have any thoughts on how political economy as a discipline might be able to move forward or contest the orthodoxy? A question we're always struggling with.
Well, you see, I think that history will take care of this. You cannot win against neoclassicism on the basis of rational arguments. This is not, I mean, this is a dialogue of the deaf. Think of the capital controversies. We won that argument. So what? They keep doing the same thing as if that debate never happened. They still have aggregate capital. They still have, production functions, aggregate production functions. And when you mention the capital controversies, none of the people that were educated after 1978 know of them. Yeah? And even John Kay in the Financial Times wrote in one of his standard columns, he said that, the capital controversies were won by the neoclassical school, which is unbelievable, given that Robert Solow, who was the main neoclassical protagonist in it, admitted that he lost it, that he lost that argument. So, you see, I don't think that it's a King Canute strategy to think that you're going to beat them on the basis of reason. Their model is self-contained. They don't want to think of alternative models. And even if you are an Arrow or a Sraffa or a John Robinson and you point out, the gurus, the people at the top of the priesthood know the truth. So the Pope is not a Christian, if you know what I mean. He's an atheist. So Arrow does not believe in neoclassicism, an equivalent Arrow. But it's the bishops and the priests and the vicars who are completely close-minded, and you can never get through to them. I remember years ago I was having a discussion with Paul Sweezy, and he told me a story which I actually reminisced over and I recalled more recently, after 2008, after Paul Sweezy had left us. It was this. He was saying to me that he was explaining, he was relating to me that his experience in the early 60s when he had a class every week at a new school. He would go, actually it wasn't a new school, it was NYU, I believe, NYU. And, you know, it was a class on Swissian political economy, monthly review stuff, right? Because it was once a week, it was not part of the normal curriculum. He was not connected to the department very much. They had given him a very large amphitheater. And he would have some like 7, 8, 10 students coming every week to listen to him and to discuss with him, very good students and so on. One day, one semester, beginning of semester, and it was upstairs, second, third floor. He had to walk up some stairs. So in some year, during the first class of the semester, he's trying to go up the steps and he can't because it's packed with students. So he's trying to squeeze his way through this mass of students. And at some point he asks him, what are you waiting for? What course are you attending? Oh, Professor Spiez's political economy. And he thought, what? And of course what had happened was the Vietnam War. So it's history that is going to make a turn that will revive, just like, you know, it was history that created political economy here. It was the Vietnam War, wasn't it? The clash of faculties as a result of that. And capitalism is guaranteed to go through another spasm that will give political economy another boost. What we need to do is keep the flame alive, waiting for history to do this. So a bit like, you know, in the Middle Ages, where we have to recapitulate the scriptures and keep the books alive and not allow the Inquisition to burn them down. That's what we need to do now.
Okay, and final question on keeping the flame alive from one of our ECOP socks. Students.
Yeah, thanks, Yanis. I'm one of those political economy graduates who likes to think that I haven't gone over to the dark side.
Not yet.
I think you've left us all with a very big question about what we do after we've taken that red pill, because I imagine most people in this room are here because, you know, because they have chosen the red pill. And, you know, I think the gentleman's question over here was quite important in that regard. And just to go back to what you said at the very beginning, actually, about the, you know, the founding axioms of neoclassical economics is that we're all individuals. I think actually going back to challenge that is one of the fundamental things we have to return to. Actually, we're a collective. Our strength is collective, and our options have to be collective. I just wanted to ask you, I guess, about your experience of being in the Syriza government and what on the left do we make of it when the government of the radical left is actually, you know, now responsible for, you know, feeding the bitter pill of austerity. And I guess I was curious whether you think the government from which you resigned, I'm sure most people know, you know, is that an example of people who think they've been chomping the red pill as it turns, you know, increasingly blue? And my second final question is it time to think about taking an even redder red pill? We actually start posing, you know, revolutionary alternatives to capitalism.
Well, I think your questions contain the answers, so I don't need to say much. I'll just very briefly comment on the first part. I'm quite happy to concede that society is made of individuals. But let's not forget that the individual outside the polis is an idiot. That is the definition of an idiot in ancient Greek. The definition of an idiot, idiotes, is a privateer. Somebody who is not part of the collective. Yeah? So it is impossible for men and women to be human unless they reflect into each other's eyes. So suddenly the individual cannot be defined by means of a function which is independent of other individuals. So if you really want to be an individualist and a humanist at the same time, you have to effectively challenge the notion that the individual is definable outside the whole. That's the first point. The second point, Look, nothing saddens me more than recounting the manner in which our government descended step by step into the abyss, into the Faustian abyss, and the way in which, in the end, the lure of power arrested key comrades, putting some of the older comrades in an incredibly difficult situation. I had an 80-year-old comrade who said to me, do you know, I've been in prison, I've been in concentration camps, I've had 2 splits of the party before, I can't go through a third one, so I'm going to stay in, while agreeing with you and with me on what is going on. This is pretty awful. Also, let me just add another story. I was stopped on the street a few days ago by a young person, 20-year-old person, who said to me, he said to me, why did you do this to us? He didn't mean it aggressively towards me, he meant we, the government, as a whole. Quite correct, and legitimately. Did you realize that on the 5th of July last year, the referendum day, you created circumstances of civil war in my own family. Since then, I have not spoken to my father, and he has not spoken to me. To do what? To sell us the next day? I'm just adding to your question, not really giving you an answer. And the third point is that, look, the red pill in the context of political economy is constantly to subvert the dominant paradigm. And that is a revolutionary act. And it can only be accomplished together.
Thank you very much. Yanis Varoufakis will be talking further at the Sydney Writers' Festival, which is unfolding now within the city. And secondly, he will be back at the University of Sydney, engaged with the Department of Political Economy in some future events. So watch this space. Thank you very much.